Jimi Hendrix never learned to read music, never took a formal lesson, never studied theory or scales the way conservatory students spend years mastering. He taught himself on a $5 guitar with a broomstick and rubber bands before that, playing by ear and feel, developing technique that would make trained musicians question everything they'd been taught. When Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck, and Pete Townshend, guitarists who had studied properly, first saw Jimi play, they didn't just recognize talent, they witnessed someone accessing music through pure intuition and obsession, proving that formal training and theoretical knowledge weren't prerequisites for genius. Music teachers who heard his recordings couldn't explain what he was doing technically because he wasn't following any established methodology. He was inventing approaches that academia would spend decades trying to reverse engineer and teach. His inability to read sheet music became his superpower, freeing him from conventional boundaries and allowing him to hear guitar as raw expression rather than as notation to be translated, proving that sometimes the most revolutionary artists are the ones who never learned the rules they were supposed to follow. Deveria descrição da thumbnail. Composição. Split screen ou contraste visual dramático. Lado esquerdo. Partitura musical tradicional, sheet music, com notas complexas, riscada com X vermelho gigante ou burning, em chamas. Lado direito. Close-up de mãos negras tocando Stratocaster, dedos no braço, técnica impossível visível, ou silhueta de guitarrista, afro, sem rosto identificável, em postura icônica. Elementos visuais. Background, dividido, metade acadêmica, formal, music school aesthetic, metade palco psicodélico, stage lights, amplifiers. Contraste, ordem versus caos, teoria versus intuição, papel versus fogo, efeito de ondas sonoras, frequências emanando da guitarra, vintage 1960s aesthetic, grain, cores contrastantes, não muito colorido, mas no ar com splashes de cor. Texto na thumb. Texto principal, grande. Never learned ou no training, vermelho, branco. Texto secundário, made Clapton quit ou quit comparing, amarelo, dourado. Pequeno detalhe, partitura musical como elemento de fundo transparente. Paleta, preto e branco dominante. Vermelho para proibido impossível, amarelo dourado para divino transcendente, vintage film grain. Mood, contraste entre academia e intuição, impossibilidade técnica versus genialidade natural. Roteiro completo, 25-30k caracteres. You're the rockstar who couldn't read music but playing like a god. There's a photograph taken at a London music school in 1967, though the exact location and date remain debated, showing a small group of formally trained guitarists gathered around a record player, their faces displaying expressions that range from confusion to something approaching existential crisis. They're listening to Purple Haze for what witnesses later described as the 4th or 5th consecutive time, and they're trying to understand how what they're hearing is technically possible, how someone is producing sounds that don't appear in any instruction manual or theory textbook they've studied, how a guitarist is making his instrument do things that their years of proper training never suggested were achievable. One of the students, who would later become a session musician of some note, apparently turned to their instructor and asked the question that everyone in that room was thinking. What technique is he using? What scale is that? How do we learn to do what he's doing? And the instructor, a classically trained guitarist who had spent decades mastering his instrument through systematic study and methodical practice, reportedly responded with words that would become part of the mythology surrounding Jimi Hendrix and his approach to guitar. I have absolutely no idea. Nothing he's doing follows any system I've ever taught or studied. It's like he's playing a completely different instrument. The revelation that would make this moment even more significant, the detail that would transform this scene from mere appreciation of innovation to something approaching philosophical crisis about the nature of musical education itself, was that Jimi Hendrix had never taken a formal guitar lesson in his life. He couldn't read sheet music. He didn't know what chord voicings were called or what theoretical principles governed them. He had developed his technique entirely through intuition and obsessive practice, learning by ear and feel rather than through the structured methodology that every person in that room had followed in their own musical development. Before we step into the story of how someone with zero formal training became the most innovative guitarist in rock history, making trained musicians question whether their years of proper education had actually limited rather than expanded their understanding of what their instrument could do, hit subscribe because what follows comes from the music teachers who couldn't explain his technique. From the trained guitarists who watched him play and realized their conservatory degrees hadn't prepared them for what was possible. From the people who understood that Jimi Hendrix's inability to read music wasn't a limitation, but was actually his greatest advantage. November 1942, Seattle, Washington. Johnny Allen Hendrix, later renamed James Marshall Hendrix by his father, is born into circumstances that provide no suggestion that music will become his path or that he possesses any particular destiny beyond the difficult childhood that poverty and family dysfunction typically produce. His mother Lucille is 17 years old, his father Al is away serving in World War II, and the family situation that awaits Jimmy's early years involves instability and neglect that would leave permanent psychological scars, even as they somehow contributed to the artistic sensitivity and emotional depth that would later define his musical expression. The details of Jimmy's childhood have been documented extensively. The poverty, the parental alcoholism, the bouncing between relatives and temporary homes, his mother's early death when Jimmy was 15, and his father's refusal to let him attend the funeral. These circumstances matter not as biography for its own sake, but because they shaped how Jimmy would relate to music when he finally discovered it, how he would use guitar as emotional outlet and psychological refuge rather than as technical challenge or academic pursuit, how his approach would be driven by need rather than by ambition or calculation. The story of Jimmy's first encounter with actual guitar, as opposed to the broomstick and rubber bands he used before acquiring a real instrument, reveals immediately how his relationship with music differed from conventional musicians following traditional paths. He didn't begin with lessons or with instruction books teaching proper hand position and basic chords. He started by listening to records, Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, Muddy Waters, B.B. King, and trying to replicate what he heard entirely by ear, developing finger positions and techniques through trial and error rather than through structured pedagogy. His first real guitar cost $5, a beaten second-hand acoustic that barely stayed in tune and that any music teacher would have considered inadequate for learning proper technique. But Jimmy didn't know what proper technique looked like or what instruments were supposed to sound like, so he just played, teaching his fingers to find the sounds he heard in his head, developing the muscle memory and the intuitive understanding of how string tension and finger pressure and pick attack combine to create different tones and textures. What makes this self-teaching significant isn't just that Jimmy learned to play without instruction, plenty of musicians do that, but that he developed approaches and techniques that formal training would have corrected or eliminated as improper. He held his guitar at unusual angles because nobody told him the correct posture. He used his thumb to fret bass notes on the low E string because he didn't know that was considered poor form. He created chord voicings that worked sonically but that didn't follow standard fingering patterns because he'd never seen chord diagrams or learned proper finger positioning. All of these mistakes that formal training would have identified and corrected became the foundation for techniques and sounds that would later be recognized as revolutionary innovations, as approaches that expanded what was considered possible on electric guitar. Jimmy's ignorance of proper methodology became his advantage because it meant he wasn't constrained by assumptions about what guitars could or should do, wasn't limited by rules about which techniques were acceptable and which represented bad habits to be corrected. By his late teens, Jimmy was playing small gigs around Seattle, his raw talent and stage presence getting him noticed, despite having no formal training or theoretical knowledge. But his real education came not from teachers or schools, but from the road, from years spent as sideman and backup guitarist for established R&B and soul acts, playing behind Little Richard, the Isley Brothers, Ike and Tina Turner, and dozens of other performers whose bands provided on-the-job training in how to perform and how to read audiences, even as they reinforced that Jimmy didn't fit conventional categories or follow normal rules. The tension that developed during these years, the conflict that would eventually push Jimmy toward going solo and developing his own approach, came from band leaders and musical directors who kept telling him to stop showing off, to play simpler, to stay in the background and not draw attention from the featured artist. These weren't criticisms of his technical ability, everyone recognized he could play, but were objections to his refusal or inability to conform to what backup guitarists were supposed to do, to provide solid rhythm and occasional fills without overwhelming the arrangement or distracting from the vocals. Multiple stories from this period involve Jimmy being fired or warned about his playing style, told that he was too flashy or too experimental or too loud, that he needed to learn to be a team player and to serve the song rather than using every song as opportunity for innovation or display. and Jimi would try to comply, would attempt to play simpler and more conventionally, but his fingers wouldn't cooperate. His musical instincts wouldn't allow him to play safe or predictable. His relationship with guitar was too direct and intuitive to be constrained by other people's ideas about proper arrangement or appropriate technique. When Chas Chandler discovered Jimi playing in a New York club in 1966 and convinced him to come to London, the opportunity represented not just geographic relocation, but liberation from contexts where his lack of formal training and his refusal to follow conventional approaches were seen as problems rather than as advantages. London's music scene in late 1966 was more open to experimentation and innovation than America's more commercially conservative industry, more willing to embrace musicians who didn't fit established categories or follow normal patterns. The formation of the Jimi Hendrix Experience in autumn 1966 and their rapid rise in the British music scene happened partly because London audiences and musicians recognized immediately that Jimi was doing something genuinely new rather than just playing blues or R&B with more volume or energy. The sounds he was producing, using feedback and distortion as compositional elements, manipulating amplifier settings to create textures rather than just amplification, approaching guitar as sound-generating instrument rather than as device for playing notes and chords, demonstrated possibilities that trained musicians hadn't considered because their education had taught them to think of guitar, within certain parameters and limitations. When Eric Clapton attended an early Jimi Hendrix Experience show at a small London club, his response reveals how Jimi's lack of formal training translated into approaches that formally educated musicians found both fascinating and disturbing. Clapton had studied blues guitar systematically, learning proper techniques from British blues pioneers who had themselves learned from American blues masters, following a pedagogical lineage that emphasized doing things correctly and respecting tradition and playing with technical precision. And then Clapton watched Jimi play guitar with his teeth, behind his back, between his legs, producing sounds that shouldn't have been possible, and doing things that no instructor would have taught because they seemed physically impossible or musically pointless. The specific detail that apparently bothered Clapton most wasn't the showmanship or the volume, but was the realization that Jimi was using techniques and approaches that Clapton's years of proper study hadn't prepared him for, that all his systematic learning hadn't revealed possibilities that this self-taught guitarist was accessing through pure intuition and experimentation. The story of Clapton leaving that club and reportedly not playing guitar for several days while he processed what he'd witnessed illustrates something crucial about how Jimi's lack of formal training affected trained musicians who encountered him. This wasn't jealousy or simple recognition that someone else was better. Clapton had already encountered plenty of skilled guitarists. This was existential questioning about whether formal training and theoretical knowledge actually helped or hindered, whether learning proper technique and studying established approaches closed off possibilities as much as it opened them. Jeff Beck's response to seeing Jimi play was similar, but more explicitly focused on the theoretical impossibility of what Jimi was doing. Beck had studied guitar formally, understood music theory, could explain technically what he was playing and why certain combinations of notes and chords worked harmonically. And none of that theoretical knowledge helped him understand how Jimi was creating the sounds Beck was hearing, what harmonic principles governed Jimi's improvisations, what theoretical framework explained his approach to melody and rhythm and texture. Beck reportedly spent hours after seeing Jimi perform trying to figure out what scales and modes Jimi was using, what chord progressions were underlying the improvisations, what theoretical system governed his approach. And gradually, Beck realized that Jimi wasn't using any theoretical system, wasn't thinking in terms of scales and modes and progressions, but was playing entirely by ear and intuition, letting his fingers find sounds that felt right without analyzing whether they fit established harmonic frameworks or followed proper voice leading principles. This realization, that Jimi's playing didn't follow any theoretical system that could be studied and replicated, was both liberating and frustrating for trained musicians. Liberating because it suggested that innovation didn't require systematic understanding or theoretical sophistication, that musical revolution could come from intuition as effectively as from formal knowledge. Frustrating because it meant Jimi's approaches couldn't be easily learned or taught, couldn't be broken down into methods that other guitarists could study and adopt, existed as expressions of individual intuition rather than as techniques that could be systematized and transmitted. The recording of the Jimi Hendrix Experience's first album, Are You Experienced?, reveals clearly how Jimi's inability to read music and his lack of theoretical training shaped his creative process in ways that formal education might have prevented or limited. The studio engineers and producers working on the album were conventionally trained, understood recording technology and signal processing according to established principles, operated within assumptions about what was possible and what would sound good. And Jimi kept asking them to do things that violated those assumptions and principles, running signals through effects in orders that shouldn't work, cranking amplifiers past the point where conventional wisdom said tone would be destroyed rather than enhanced, using feedback and distortion in ways that recording engineers had spent years learning to eliminate rather than to create. The studio personnel repeatedly told Jimi that what he was asking for wouldn't work or would sound terrible, that his intuitions were wrong and his requests violated basic principles of recording and signal processing. Jimi's response, according to multiple accounts, was simply to ask them to try it anyway, to experiment and see what happened rather than assuming that established principles represented limits on what was possible. And repeatedly, the results proved that Jimi's intuitions were correct, even when they contradicted conventional training and theoretical understanding, that his ear and his feel for sound were more reliable guides than the systematic knowledge that formal education had provided to the trained professionals around him. The track Purple Haze became the definitive example of how Jimi's lack of formal training translated into innovation that trained musicians couldn't have anticipated or achieved. The opening chord, an augmented dominant chord that doesn't follow standard harmonic principles and that music theory students learn to use carefully within specific contexts, announced immediately that this music wasn't going to follow conventional rules or respect established boundaries. Music teachers who analyzed Purple Haze later struggled to explain what Jimi was doing harmonically, what theoretical principles governed his chord choices, how the song's structure related to established compositional frameworks. Their analyses revealed that Jimi was combining elements from different musical traditions, blues, jazz, R&B, rock, without any systematic approach or theoretical understanding of how those elements related, just putting together sounds that felt right and that created the textures and emotional effects he wanted, regardless of whether they followed proper voice leading or harmonic progression. Rules. The guitar solo in Purple Haze similarly demonstrated how Jimi's ear and intuition trumped formal training and theoretical knowledge. Trained guitarists analyzing the solo couldn't identify what scale he was using because he wasn't using any single scale, but was mixing notes from different modes and frameworks, playing purely by feel and letting his fingers find sounds that worked emotionally and sonically without checking whether they fit theoretical systems or followed established improvisation principles. When rock musicians and guitar students began trying to learn Jimi's songs and solos, they encountered enormous difficulty because his playing didn't follow patterns that could be easily analyzed and replicated. Guitarists who had learned through formal training expected to be able to identify scales and chord progressions and then practice those elements until they could reproduce what Jimi played. But Jimi's approaches didn't break down that way, didn't follow systematic patterns that could be isolated and studied, required developing the same intuitive relationship with guitar that Jimi had cultivated, rather than just learning techniques that could be practiced and mastered. This difficulty in teaching and learning Jimi's approaches frustrated music educators who wanted to incorporate his innovations into guitar pedagogy but discovered that his techniques resisted systematization. How do you teach someone to play by pure feel and intuition when the entire structure of music education is built around systematic learning and theoretical understanding? How do you help students develop the kind of direct, unmediated relationship with their instrument that Jimi possessed when formal training inherently mediates that relationship through theory and methodology? Some guitar teachers responded by simply telling their students that Jimi's approaches were too advanced or too individual to be taught, that students should focus on learning proper technique and theoretical understanding first before attempting to understand or replicate what Jimi did. But other teachers recognized that this response fundamentally misunderstood what made Jimi's playing significant and innovative, that it wasn't advanced technique built on proper fundamentals, but was alternative approach that bypassed formal training entirely and accessed guitar through completely different pathway. Pete Townshend, watching Jimi perform at Monterey Pop Festival, apparently experienced revelations similar to what Clapton and Beck had already encountered. The recognition that formal training and systematic learning might actually limit innovation as much as enabling it, that sometimes the most revolutionary approaches come from artists who never learned the rules they were supposed to follow. Townshend had developed his own unconventional approaches to guitar, using the instrument rhythmically and percussively rather than just melodically, but he'd done so while still operating within frameworks that formal training had provided. Jimi was operating outside those frameworks entirely, treating guitar as sound generation device whose possibilities were unlimited by conventional assumptions about what the instrument was supposed to do. The famous guitar burning at Monterey, beyond its theatrical and symbolic significance, represented something about Jimi's relationship with his instrument that formal training tends to eliminate or suppress. The recognition that guitar is just wood and wire, and electronics, that treating it reverently or carefully, or according to proper technique, misses opportunities to explore what happens when you push the instrument past its designed limitations and intended uses. Trained musicians learn to take care of their instruments and to use them properly. Jimi learned to use his guitar, however, produced the sounds he wanted regardless of whether that was proper or sustainable or respectful of the instrument's integrity. When Jimi died in September 1970 at age 27, the question of how to understand and transmit his innovations became urgent for music educators and guitar teachers, who recognized that something important and revolutionary would be lost if Jimi's approaches remained individual expressions that couldn't be taught or systematized. But attempts to analyze his technique and to break down his innovations into teachable methods repeatedly encountered the same problem. Jimi's playing was inseparable from his intuitive relationship with guitar, couldn't be reduced to techniques and principles that could be studied independently of the direct, unmediated engagement with sound that Jimi had developed through years of pure experimentation unconstrained by formal training. Modern guitar education has incorporated some of Jimi's innovations. His use of feedback and distortion as compositional elements, his rhythmic approaches that blur boundaries between lead and rhythm playing, his exploration of the electric guitar's sonic possibilities beyond just amplification of acoustic guitar techniques. But what gets taught is always sanitized and systematized versions of what Jimi did, approaches that can be broken down into lessons and exercises and theoretical principles, necessarily different from the raw intuitive exploration that characterized Jimi's actual relationship with his instrument. The irony is that music schools now teach Hendrix-style guitar technique as advanced subject requiring years of foundational training before students are ready to approach it, completely inverting the actual path Jimi followed, where lack of formal training was prerequisite for developing the approaches that now get taught as advanced technique. Students spend years learning proper fundamentals and a theoretical understanding before being introduced to Jimi's innovations, never experiencing the direct intuitive relationship with guitar that made those innovations possible in the first place. Some contemporary guitar teachers have recognized this problem and have tried to develop pedagogical approaches that emphasize ear training and intuitive exploration over theoretical understanding and systematic technique, trying to recreate the conditions that allowed Jimi to develop his revolutionary approaches. But formal education inherently structures and mediates learning in ways that make it difficult to truly replicate the unguided experimentation that self-taught musicians experience, difficult to create educational environments where students can develop genuinely individual relationships with their instruments rather than learning approaches that teachers have already systematized and validated. The lasting significance of Jimi Hendrix's inability to read music and his lack of formal training isn't just that he succeeded despite these limitations, but that these supposed limitations were actually essential prerequisites for his innovations. That formal education would have constrained and redirected the intuitive exploration that produced his revolutionary approaches to electric guitar. His story challenges fundamental assumptions about music education and about the relationship between training and innovation, suggesting that sometimes the best preparation for revolutionizing an art form is never learning how it's supposed to be done. When you listen to Jimi Hendrix playing Voodoo Child or Machine Gun, when you hear guitar producing sounds that still seem impossible 50 years later, despite all the analysis and instruction and systematic teaching that's happened in the decades since he died, you're hearing someone whose inability to read sheet music and whose lack of theoretical training freed him to hear guitar as pure possibility, unlimited by assumptions about what the instrument should sound like or what techniques were proper or what harmonic principles should govern improvisation. The music teachers who couldn't explain his technique were right. Nothing he was doing followed established systems or proper methodology. But their inability to explain didn't represent failure of Jimi's approach. It represented the inadequacy of formal systems and theoretical frameworks to capture or contain innovation that comes from pure intuition and unguided exploration, from treating limitations as invitations rather than as boundaries, from never learning the rules that would have prevented him from playing like God who'd never been told that gods aren't supposed to exist.